Sorry, I can make you one out of paper. Morning, we should have one out
We're the same. This is more. I know more about that. Go ahead. Oh, that was that about Wow. Waiting for the signal from the back. That's room tone. That is room tone. Jay, can you check if it said there's a red button on there? See what it says? I already started it.
Okay. It says stop broadcasting.
No, keep going. You're all set.
Show what's going on. Where's the camera?
Camera. Two in the ceiling.
In my lapel. In my shoe phone.
I'm just waiting for the go. So. Please bear with me.
No leaning on the table.
Yeah, we should put the lockdown on that.
We can do this. We have to take our feet.
Just waiting for the go. 1 minute. That's the one he approved.
It's the exact same.
So I guess we could start with who knows what this is. Right?
I do.
Yeah. Is that a floppy disk? Well, not so floppy.
What's on the big side of it?
It is Don't Break This Rhythm. And back when, it has Peter Gabriel, produced by Daniel Lanois and Peter Gabriel, engineered by Kevin Killen. Credits on the media itself.
It's because you lived and died by your friends.
We good? All right. Well, welcome everybody to Play With Your Music. This is our first set of live interviews, and we're pleased to have with us Kevin Killen, engineer, producer, mixer, and Jerry Marotta, percussionist extraordinaire. And I'm Alex Ruthman, Associate Professor of Music Education and Music Technology here at the NYU Steinhardt School. And I'm pleased also to have my colleague Alex Case from UMass Lowell. So today we're thrilled to start off our live interview series with Kevin and with Jerry to talk a little bit about their involvement in the creative processes and thinking behind Peter Gabriel's legendary So album, in particular the tracks Sledgehammer and In Your Eyes, which Peter has graciously provided us access to for our Play With Your Music course. And if you're watching this video and have not participated in the course, you're finding it through other means, you can come and join the community and start interacting with everybody at playwithyourmusic.org. So to get started, I'd like to start with Kevin. And one of the things when in doing research and reading other articles that you've contributed to and videos is I started getting curious about your musical background before you got to your stage of becoming an engineer. We hear a lot of you. I think you're studying the sciences at Trinity
That's correct.
College.
Yeah.
and had an interest in music, and then fell into a recording studio and apprenticing through that. But what was your musical background before apprenticing in college, and what led you then? Could you trace that development there to your work yourself?
Well, I'm one of 8 kids. My parents raised us in Dublin, Ireland, and all my siblings, who 5 of them were older than me, all interested in music, so I grew up surrounded by music. And as a teenager, I started to play guitar. And then I really got interested in drumming. So I was really just playing drums with friends, and I had no real aspiration to be a musician, but I certainly loved the instrument. And so I bought myself a drum set, a career drum set, Royal Blue. And my parents at that point let me to leave the house because I had a and so as I was going through the equivalent of high school here, or secondary school in Ireland, I tried to figure out what I wanted to do for my college course. And I was actually interested in becoming a mechanical engineer. And so through that college process, the first year I missed out getting into a course in mechanical engineering training by 1 point of the point system. So I decided I'd go back and repeat the course the following year. And then the next year I had the same number of points. Actually, I increased my points by 1 point. So I would have thought that, except they had also increased it by 1 point. So then I got bumped into my second choice, which was the sciences. And I was very keen on science. So I went into Trinity College, and I was in the class with about 300 students. And we had pre-med students, science students, and pharmacy students all in the first year freshman class. And the dean of the faculty, maybe in the first week or so, announced that he didn't really care whether we showed up for class, and he didn't really care whether we participated, what he was concerned about was our year-end. And that really turned me off to the notion of spending the next 4 years in Trinity, even though the wonderful faculty and a great community. But I started thinking, well, is this something I really want to do for the rest of my life? So I got through my first year, enjoyed it, to a certain degree, did okay in my examinations. And then in my second year, I really started to question whether this was something interesting. And I was still playing, and I was taking drumming lessons from a teacher. And when it got around to February of my second year, I started thinking, what am I going to do this summer? I need to make some money from education. And so I started looking around at various opportunities, and I'd seen a documentary on the making of police records. That was like a really fascinating thing. How do they actually make records? So I literally pulled out the yellow pages and looked up recording studios in Dublin, and I went around to every recording studio there was. Fortunately enough, there was a studio that was sitting at Killen. Just as an intern, really good summer, essentially.
And then are there particular things that you learned from your prior musical experiences that you still draw on today as a producer, an engineer, mixer on various projects?
So that very first studio I worked at was set up, so there were 3 principal owners. One of the owners was a jingle writer. So every morning, Monday through Friday, studio time was set aside for writing jingles. Recording jingles, so 9 a.m. to 1 o'clock with the jingle slots. And then typically there was an hour switchover 2 to 11 o'clock. It's like traditional album projects or single projects. And then from what we call the graveyard shift, it was open to the staff to find young artists to come in. And so the thing that was really formative for me was the jingle exposure, because in a typical 4-hour session, you would have to go in, set up the studio, record a full rhythm section, do vocal overdubs, do musical overdubs, mix, edit between a 30-second to 60-second and 90-second spot, and give all those copies. Tape copies, so 1/4 inches and 1/2 inch tape copies, plus cassettes, all documented and handed to the client within a 4-hour period. So that discipline of having, I guess, just the fortitude to figure out how you want to impose your system on the session to exact the maximum amount of time. And that stayed with me through the years, just like being prepared in the session, making sure everything is buttoned down for the piece of music. So it was not uncommon to be in the studio at 7 a.m. or 9 a.m. start. So I made sure that all the cables were set, all the microphones were set, everything was preset. As soon as the musicians came in, within 10 minutes, you'd already got a balance. So I can still work very fast in that environment and getting sounds, and I try not to let the process get in the way.
What were you balancing back then? I mean, what were you working? What was the recording platform?
So the recording platform was
It wasn't Pro Tools. It wasn't.
No, it was a Studer 16 track A80, and then we had a Helios console that was 32 in, and that's pretty much it. It was a long rectangular room. It was just one control room, just a one-room facility. It was like kind of an Eastlake design, live end, dead end, array. And it was a pretty tight-sounding room, but it was really, it was pretty nice. We had a drum booth that was probably the size of that corner, and the drummer would squeeze his drum set in there, climb over the full time to get in the drum store.
But you had to mix. Everything had to be recorded. You only had 16 tracks.
You only had 16 tracks, so drums were typically on 4. So it was kit, which had like toms mixed into it, and hi-hat, and then kick and snare. Yeah. And then 1 track for bass, 2 tracks for acoustic guitar, 2 tracks for piano, 1 for maybe some organ or whatever the keyboard was going on, and then a couple spare tracks, and no automation. We had no automation, so everything was mixed by. So typically mixing would be you've done your basic tracks, you've done the vocal overdubs, the background parts, and you just take a little piece of white sticky tape and you put it on the fader and you make your move, make your marks, represent your moves, and then a couple would grab behind the console and just move the faders, and it was a performance.
Right, so, but it took oftentimes took more than one person.
Yeah, it was
so they had you there. Yeah. You were there like, okay, when this part comes, pull that down.
Yeah.
People like at the console all moving the faders.
That's right. Yeah, usually the writer and the writer and the producer were the same person. They would probably do the vocal portion, and I would often do the rhythm section. And so I'd be doing drums and bass, and they'd be doing the vocal.
So a multi-person performance.
Multi-person performance, yeah. And you sometimes you make a mistake. You go stop, and you're recording to record it, turn that, you stop. So okay, let's just roll back 5 seconds and pick it up, and then you finish off the piece, and then you literally
splice it together.
But I mean, these were short jingles. I mean, the longest jingle we ever did was a 2-minute piece.
Oh yeah, sure.
So you would record a 2-minute piece, and then you would edit that down to your 60-second component or 45-second, 15-second, whatever the derivation of that was. You would edit. So you would do a fade up on the performance and a fade up. It was all.
Great way to learn.
It was a great way to learn.
You had to do it fast.
You had to do it fast.
And they weren't. Nobody was probably real worried about. It wasn't like working on a Peter Gabriel record where it's hyper examining every aspect of what you're doing. Just get the job done.
And you had like a great core group of session players whose job was like they knew they were coming in for an hour. They were going to execute on the task they had in front of them. And then they were going to go off to another session in another studio and do the same thing. And maybe come back to you for the afternoon session. And in the evening sessions, that would be the graveyard shift because this was like 79, 1980, 1981. The whole punk new wave explosion was occurring in the UK, and so everybody who was in the band in Dublin wanted to get signed to a record deal. And that typically at the time was a couple £100,000, maybe like $3,000 or $40,000 to a record album. So everybody wanted to go in and make it down, and so the studio was like, well, we're not going to put our chief engineer on there, but you can work with somebody young, and for a flat fee of a couple £100,000, we'll give you the studio tape and an engineer and an assistant. So we can make whatever mistakes we could. And the great thing about the system at the studio I worked with, which was called Lombard Sound, was that the chief engineer, his name was Philip Eglin, he was very willing to listen to your work that you did on the graveyard shift. And so I remember him playing in my very first demo that I did. Friends, in fact, a group of friends that I played with. And it was the worst recording. I actually found the cassette of it there a couple of years ago later, and it was pretty. But he was really magnanimous, and he said, "Well, it's a good start. And this is where you need to, like I had all the gain stages and the balances were really good. But he was gracious enough to say, look, why don't you put the multi-track in here where you maybe this is how you can make it better." And so you learned literally on the fly.
Sure.
There was no course. I think there was a Tonmeister course at college in Surrey, and that was it. I mean, there weren't that many manuals. So literally the only manuals you would read were the tech manuals. So it was a question of being engaged. And because I was, technically interested and curious, I was always willing to kind of take up the mountain goal. I don't understand what the circle means, but it's something your education every day. That was my grounding.
Great, thank you. Well, let's fast forward to Ashcombe House. When you worked with Peter Gabriel on So, the participants in this online community might find it reassuring to know that this wasn't a typical commercial recording studio. It was actually a home studio.
Yeah.
At a very high level. So I wonder if you could sort of paint a picture of what you saw when you walked into the place for the first time in terms of who's where and what's where. I imagine there were serious acoustic treatments, that sort of thing, just so that our participants can sort of see that maybe their home studio working environments are able to achieve high production standards.
So Ashcombe House was Peter's working studio for the Birdie soundtrack and for So. And it was located in an old farmhouse. It was about 7 miles outside Bath, in the western part of the UK. And when I got there, it was basically a long rectangular building.
It was a cow barn.
It was a cow barn. It had, in its previous iteration, it had never been a cow shed, so it was a brick structure, about 1 foot and a half. And I think it had a metal roof.
I don't know.
I think it had a metal roof that had some kind of diffusion above. Anyway, I walked in, so the first third of that building was the control room. You had to walk up the steps to get it. So I don't know if it had been raised, you would be putting a screen there, or that was from the original footprint of the building. And when you walked in, there was an SSL, a 4000E series, straight in front of you. And then to the right were the 2 tape machines, 2 Studer. One was a
Lyric?
No, there was a Studer A80, and then he had that modified Studer that Colin Broad, the local kind of audio expert, had modified.
Sure.
So he had a transport in the chassis, all the body parts or something here. And then there was some behind the back wall were all Peter's keyboards, like Fairlight and Prophet, and the CP70, and there was an emulator, and there was a few other things with a boombox. And then
Polymove.
Yeah, Polymove. And then we had a couple of microphone stands for various things. And then that was pretty much it. It was pretty rudimentary. There was a Revox E77 up there. And there was a.
That was his kind of, at that point, that was probably his way of recording an idea.
Yeah, it was
It was like like having a little cassette deck.
Yeah.
Now a DAT machine.
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry.
It's
Adderall.
Yeah. So, but it was quite rudimentary, and then so the main entrance into the building, there was, when you walk straight ahead, there was a little tech station. To the right was the recording space. So there was no visual contact between the control room and the space. And the recording space had a lot of concrete, a couple of windows, and there was also a window in the control, so you could see the daylight. You looked up and see people kind of or cows still outside.
Yeah, but I'm sorry, but I was in that building long before it was a studio, because he had rented that house for us to stay in, and we rehearsed in that room for a few years. We were rehearsing in that room, and pre-So, we recorded in there, but they brought in a truck. It was like the Rolling Stones truck, and as often happened back then, it was a country lane, and I remember the truck came in from the wrong direction and couldn't make the turn up to the. So everything Peter tried to do back then, if it was supposed to take 2 hours, it could take like 5 days to figure out how to get the truck. They couldn't get it out. It was unbelievable. But so we initially recorded. We started recording in there before anything was done with it. Any kind of treatment. They eventually did get that recording truck in the driveway. And we started recording in that very same way. But it was never meant. Yeah, it was.
Yeah, it wasn't really conceived as a studio. It kind of evolved.
I remember when he put the window. The cows would come out of the field down, and they would walk by the window. And one day we came to the studio, and there was this haze all over the studio. The cows were licking. They were licking the window. From the outside, as they were walking by, they just started licking the window. So it was this beautiful view. We went in one day. We got in, and you couldn't hardly see everything. The cow saliva, because the cows were walking by and licking the window. Classic Peter.
It was classic Peter. the actual recording space took up the other 2/3 of the building, just half of the building. And it was, again, there wasn't a lot of treatment, there was a lot of concrete. And we got separate PA in there just to kind of blast ideas when he was working on the keyboard. So we had a duplicate setup in the room, some 70 in the drum machine. So just a way to get ideas down quickly so that you could then come in. So that was the basis. So it really wasn't purposely designed to do that, but it was remarkable working there.
And without going down the rabbit hole of which mics were where, can you speak generally to how such great sounds came out of that space, not really intended for? Is it all in the hands of the performer and their instruments, or is there advice you could be giving people?
I do think it does. Yeah, I do think it comes down to performing. A lot of performers from the musicians that were hired to play in the room. My job, and I always feel myself when I'm just hired as an engineer, is to, one aspect of the recording, just to be the documentarian, to capture what's going on in the room. And then, if appropriate, then to take that and maybe expand upon it and create something from that would inspire and further. I think a lot of it, because we had a very basic setup, and we were, that console, we used all the microphones on the console, we used all the EQ on the console, everything was processed through that console, which, of course, makes New York do SSLs as being an improved console. There's the helps being hard on. In the UK, the power of the 220, the power of the actually gives them different sounds. So it never felt like it being the same in console. So, but I do think it's down to the players.
Well, it's interesting, if you don't mind. It's not about So, but the Security record, which was the record before. David Lord was the producer, engineer, and he was a local guy, lived in Bath. I remember, for about a year and a half after that record came out, every studio I went into, not only did they have the record in the controller, but they got the version of Kevin when he was summer interning at his studio to ask me if I would stay after the session. They wanted to talk about the record because it was kind of in a different way, it was a groundbreaking record song. And it's so funny because talking to David Lord, I remember running into David Lord, who recorded it and mixed it, and he said, "Jerry, I can't believe anybody thinks that record sounds good because they did things that you were never supposed to do. It was all analog tape, so bouncing drums from back and forth. How many times can you do that? How many times can you bounce from one analog to another analog machine? And you're not supposed to do that at all. But they were just, Peter was Peter. He had to just constantly wanted to try new things, including getting to a point where they were bouncing stuff, and the oxide on the tape was like, if you didn't get this bounce right, the storage was gone. Yeah, it was it. If it didn't go down properly. So, I think that says a lot about what, first of all, especially with Peter creatively, he sets the table for people to do things that they're, go beyond their, their, not their ability, but just their sensibility. Just doing, continuing to trying to, he had it in his head, but he never really articulated it because it was like, it wasn't something you could write out and hand to somebody. But it was the sound, it was a sound and atmosphere, and I was involved not so much on So, but on the records prior to that process with him, over time, just working out how to get the music to sound right, and then hopefully have it be recorded well. But I think, as I said, with David Lord and the Security record, they do whatever they had to do. You know what I mean? To be able to make it be what he wanted it to be, regardless of whether it was like technologically the right thing to do. So I think there's a little bit of both, but oftentimes I think the records that have that kind of soulfulness are more successful than that could not sound so great are more successful than records that sound really great, but the creative side of it is kind of like, I think you're better off to some degree. You know, if you can get them both working for you, that's great. But creatively, I think those older records really proved that was. And I think with So, you know, in the end, when you listen to the record, it's phenomenally recorded, but the playing, the creativity on it, it's just unbelievable.
So it's sort of an unfair or even impossible question, but our online participants might wish they could have been a fly on the wall for some of those sessions where both of you are asked to be a creative extension of those that you're describing. There's this really motivating force to the whole project. But can you describe how that works? How you find your way to a drum part that's in his head and he's describing it as a texture or an atmosphere, and you convert that into a performance and iterate? Is there any way to sort of tell one of those stories?
Well,
I
think for me, first of all, we were very compatible. He really liked the way I played. He liked my drumming a lot. So just to start with, we were in a good place. And then, you know, we'd experiment as much as we could. And, you know, early on, it was, you know, maybe a 24 track. They weren't even, you couldn't even sync two machines. So, you know, we had our hands full trying to create this stuff and get it all onto 24 tracks. But, and then, of course, it didn't hurt to have Tony Levin was the bass player, you know, throughout my time with Peter, which was about 10 years. Just Larry Fast. It just was a phenomenal group of people that, we just worked so well together. Peter had so much trust and respect for what we were doing. And of course, we did for him as well. But, you know, it just seemed to work. There was never a situation where there was any real frustration or anger over something that any one of us did. But we would sometimes we would just try something and then we'd come back and do it again, try it differently. But yeah, we developed a real bond as a band.
So you really were an ensemble, assembled in the studio, but you really were a band.
Yeah, we had worked together on for many years. Tony and Larry worked with Peter on his first record, the Salisbury Hill record. I started playing with him just after that. So we worked together for about 10 years. And yeah, we developed a tremendous rapport. It's interesting because I remember recording a song that he didn't have finished, and he didn't have a title for it. But it was, I think it ended up being Big Time. But we did our version of Big Time, like that. It was like Security, the next generation. And I had goosebumps for like a day. So deep. Really deep. And we were so good at not getting that. You know, it was so many years of doing it together. It didn't take us that long to get to that place. You know what I mean? Because we just had developed a working relationship with him. And it was, you know, it was fierce. Fierce. It's funny, I wonder if there's a version of it somewhere. I always wonder about that, because it's nothing like the one that's on the record. It certainly wouldn't have been, I don't think it would have been a big hit, because it was that Peter. It was Peter pre-so Peter. And, but yeah, it was incredible. We did a few tracks like that, that ended up being different, ultimately on the record.
No, Peter, I'm sure there's no title in something because we've never discarded any musical instrument. So it's there somewhere.
Yeah.
Whether he can put his finger on it, I'm not sure, but it exists.
It might just be on cassette, but it exists.
But it may be. But we were always recording. We're always in a mode where we're always recording every idea. We're trying to make sure that whatever was in occurring in the room, whether it was in the control room or in the room space, that it was getting documented, because you never knew when that particular idea might yield like a breakthrough to the song for him lyrically, or to take the song in a different direction. Those moments did occur while I was there. So, you know, a lot of times it was happenstance, and sometimes it was because we were exploring the songs. But yeah, with Peter, he always surrounded himself with great musicians like Jerry, and Tony, and David Rhodes, and Darren. And sometimes after the tracking dates, when a musician was available, he would have them come down to the studio, and he would have them play new ideas on the existing tracks. Sometimes that would then spawn a whole new idea. So you were constantly like going around. It wasn't like a typical record where you go in and say, well, the first couple of weeks you just record the basic tracks, and they're the basic tracks, and you're not going to change that much. They're constantly churning and reinventing themselves. And just because the creative process was such that Peter was looking for these trigger points for lyrical ideas, and because his approach to lyrical ideas were he had to invest himself in the track and really draw these lyrics out of himself. And he's very particular about what he wants to say and sing. And that process took a really long time. You still had to keep the churn going. It was a lot of fun to do that, but it's still quite a lot of management in terms of tape, and resources.
A very typical Gabriel story. It would be, I could be out tuning with just like it, and he'll run and go, I love that. I love that. Like he'll find something. He'll have it in his head. All of those archive things. He'll have it. Get this tape. Get this thing you're working on. And do that. Like randomly banging on something. And turning it drunk. You know what I mean? He's the king of that. The more you try to do something, like sort of in a standard way, the less he liked it. Which is ironic, and probably a whole nother gathering about the fact that really So was the one time that he didn't do that. Where it ended up being a lot more mainstream, ultimately, like Big Time and Sledgehammer, like they're much more sort of stock arrangements. You know what I mean? They were more straightforward and very much geared towards a certain kind of music, like R&B. But some of this earlier stuff, he was always trying to just push the envelope and find ways to make things sound like they weren't supposed to sound. He would do that a lot, and we had a lot of fun. So breakthroughs would happen, like sometimes you'd be kind of working, trying something, and then you get away from it, and then somehow something would happen, and bam, it would just come together, like in a short period of time. That somehow it all gelled. It's interesting. But he was very good at knowing when that moment. I think that's one of the things he does best. He does a lot of things really well. Knowing how to make that moment happen, or recognizing, even in the tuning of the drum. It's like, that's what I want. I want it to sound like a guy playing drums. I want it to sound like this. A guy's out the back and he's hammering something. Not particularly in time. He's so good at recognizing when those things are brilliant.
That's great.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the sort of discipline and work ethic associated with this album. It's pretty famous for long days and long production time, and one might just listen to the recordings and think, well, it sounds like some monster players were just jamming, and all you had to do was get it on tape and done. But I think behind that was not quite an 8 to 5 job, but a 20-hour day. If you could just sort of describe the routine, how did you guys know when to show up, know when to stop?
Well, I got called into the record. Dan Lenoir and I had worked the prior year in Dublin with a YouTube project, and I had moved to New York right after it. And so Dan and I were still in communication, and I visited his studio in Hamilton, just outside Toronto, just like previous following New Year. Anyway, Dan called me and asked me if I'd be interested in coming to mix there. So my brief was that I was going to the UK for 6 weeks, 2 weeks. And I flew from New York to Heathrow at the end of May, beginning of June in 1985. And at that time it was a 3-hour drive from Heathrow down to the studios in here. And so I was driving down with the assistant, this gentleman named Dave Stallman, and we're just chit-chatting as we go through the time. He said, so how long did they ask you to stay? And I said, maybe 6 weeks, 2 months. You're going to be here for 10 minutes. And I was like, what do you mean you're going to be here for 10 minutes? Well, I know Peter, and I know where the record is right now. You're going to be here for 10 minutes. So I was really perplexed, and I said, I don't really understand. He said, you'll understand when you go. So I got there, and Dan had alluded to it a little bit. So when they had done the initial tracking that Dan and David Baskin, who was a Peter's engineer, had initially done with the band, they had played over Peter's original demos. Peter had 2 tape machines, 2 Studer A80s. One was like a stock A80, and then one was the modified. And the day before the tracking occurred, they installed an out-of-suite synchronizer. And that synchronizer assumed that both machines were operating, on the same level. That synchronized card was the same. It was an FM card, and it was a DC card. But they were supposed to be, the synchronizer was set up to send pulses to 2 FM cards. So that was one issue. Then you had the issue of, Peter had his demos originally on, it was like a 2-track Lindrum pattern, probably a Prophet pad, maybe some percussion, and they were the basic demos that he played to the band. And we're in the studio space and they were playing around. So the demo was on the B reel, and then they were going to the A machine, which is a standard A80. And so when they get through that first reel, they'd say, oh, but they take up on the B machine, and this is what performs, and we record over to a fresh piece of tape on the A machine. So they kept doing that until they got multi-tape. What was occurring was that the 2 machines were drifting. They didn't know they were drifting. And then on top of that, because the A80 had a capstan motor, which literally pinched the tape and literally pulled it through from one side of the supply reel to the taker. First 3 minutes of the tension of the reel, and the last 3 minutes of the tension of the reel weren't uniform, so they kept on a little bit of wobble. So afterwards, they discovered which they should bring that, take 1 and take 6, when you put them on the 2 machines and hit play, and start and start getting. The drift would get wider and wider.
That doesn't seem good.
No, it's not good. It's not what they intended, and they didn't even realize that was. So part of my brief was to come in and help with keeping the day-to-day flow of the project, which Dan had a really good overview to keep that going, and then also to try and come up with a system where we could then somehow resynchronize tape, the master tape with the slave reels, and that took a process. And that's what David was alluding to when we driving in the back. Plus, he also knew that Peter hadn't really written it. It was only a certain way forward in writing. So it was going to take a fair amount of time for those 2 to connect. And so that was part of so our day was broken up into, he would arrive at the studio pretty early in the day, maybe around 9:30 in the morning. We'd have 2 girls after school. And then we would work to lunch and we'd break for like half an hour and then come back in and work from like 2 in the afternoon until 7 and have a break. And then Dan and I would work on some other ideas, maybe some dance videos or maybe some editing. And then Dan would go to bed and then I would stay up and then I would have a long list of things that I needed to go through to get nice enough from afterwards. And that was, it was 25, so nothing but time. We were in the middle of the countryside. So it was 7 miles from civilization and I wasn't driving, so I didn't care. I just stayed.
10 months later, you left and you were 30.
Yeah, 10 months later, I was 30. And I had a beard. I went fresh face and came out with a beard. I went with one little small bag and I left with 2 papers.
That was one of the things about working out in the country there. It was like being, it was like a survival.
Yeah.
It really was being out in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah. But it was a great experience, and Peter was incredibly gracious as his time. And he surrounded himself with great people, so you didn't mind putting in the long hours. And I've been in huge Genesis fan, so it was this. But there were challenges for sure. That's a challenge. And one of the things you have to remember with analog, and I'm sure But you remember this, you're always battling. So, we've set for tracking, you set the microphones, you have the musician in the room, and you're listening to what we would call input. You're listening live to the feed from the microphones to the console, and you're hearing how great it sounds. And then you would flip over to take return, and you'd hear what's coming back multi-track. And it was never quite the same. And people love the way analog sound. And I was always frustrated because what I wanted to record was what was on the input side. What I was getting back was a close approximation, but it wasn't what I really wanted to hear. It was maybe a little squidgy sounding, or maybe the top end seemed like not quite as good as I thought it was. And the bass was maybe a little fatter or a little more diffuse than what was coming in the console. So you had that on the first one in the playback, and then every other playback, because we're dealing with the issue that we're literally physically pulling this tape across our hands, physically pushing the tape across this hamstring. You're getting the physical properties of the oxide falling off the tape, so you get the shedding. So you're constantly battling that in your head. First day you recorded versus what you now have, which was always slightly changing. So to me, it was always frustrating that you had this great sound source, and you could never really get back to that source. So we were always trying to devise methods to how to make it more brilliant, compensate for the fact that it was going to lose, frequency response over time. A project like Peter's, where it lasts such a long time, that was really concerning.
And you would actively do that sort of EQ things differently to anticipate generation loss?
A little bit, yeah. We tended to record a little bit more on the brighter side, and assume that over time it would just slowly be more mellow. And but we were also, when we were recording, it was definitely an approach to download. And Peter Lot 2 was that instead of just having one player come up with a part, they would actually come together with 3 or 4 different instruments and combine those instruments together into a tape, and with treatments and with effects and with processing. So then when you pushed up those faders, there wasn't necessarily an obvious thing, this is just a piano, this is just a guitar part, it's like some other combination. And we did that partially because we wanted to, after the performance was recorded, we always wanted to have that sound on tape, documented exactly as it was. Because you play differently when you're playing for as opposed to when you're hearing them on the monitors. And also because you wanted to impose a certain structure on the arrangement.
Well, as you know, for this online community, Peter Gabriel has made available 8-track stems for In Your Eyes and Sledgehammer. And I wonder if there's an example that you think that students might later find, either in the mixed recording or in these stems, that might be a good example of those sort of printed
composite stands.
Yeah. Anything that comes to mind that might be obvious enough that students can study later?
I think in the chorus part of In Your Eyes, that part, the arpeggiated guitar part is actually a combination of guitar, piano, and keyboards.
Should we maybe try to listen to a bit of this?
Sure. Should we pull up the pads as well?
Yeah. I don't really know how the pads are configured, so if you're interested to hear.
Take a listen.
But originally, when I joined the project, that song was called 61, was the title. And the whole verse part represented in the song didn't actually exist, like the chord progression. Peter, during his period of writing lyrics for the song, stumbled upon that chord progression. And he came in and said, I want to change the whole verse. And so we had actually, the song was probably already 70% done, all of a sudden would have changed. You know, not from the drum perspective, but certainly from monitoring would have changed.
That sounds like Peter.
And that would be Peter. And that part, the part that was the chorus, I think, was originally like the pre-chorus. Then not only are you dealing with the fact that all of a sudden we have to mute all these parts, find tracks for the new parts, and now we're going to have to actually physically change the structure. So it's cutting across 2-inch tape, which is fine to edit 2-inch tape, but when you have a master reel and 6 slave reels and 5 slave reels all tied together for synchronization, you realize that as soon as you put the edit across the 2-inch tape, the synchronization is rendered useless. So, that posed an interesting series of technical obstacles that we need to overcome. So yes, so things like that would occur.
And you were starting to say that this arpeggiating the high guitar part isn't just guitar.
It's two guitar parts together. I always thought there was a piano part in there. So we'll see. Let's try it. It's two guitar parts on the shoe. You can hear the keyboard in the back there. Well, can we do it actually? I know these stems are stereo or mono. They're mono, so they're not collapsed. For the purpose of UI.
But that was a fader. That was a fader.
Originally would have been in stereo.
That in stereo, but all of that.
Yeah.
That was all blended
Blended
down
together, yeah, with effects.
Great. I mean, that's so. I mean, a classic Peter tried not to get it to sound like what it is.
Right.
You know, to create sounds. Like for instance, when I was working with him, I remember it was like very early on with synthesizers, very. And I remember Larry coming in with a Prophet 5. He got a Prophet 5 delivered to the studio, and I just watched him take it out of the box. He didn't even plug it in. He just got a screwdriver out. He opened it up. He went right in, looked around, started looking at stuff, and then he kind of dove in and he did a few things to it. I don't know what that was. And closed it up and, what you doing? What the hell were you doing? He didn't even plug it in to see what it's doing. He's like, no, I knew I had to go in and look and see. And then there were a couple things he said I kind of wanted to change a few little things that they had done with it. So. But we never used, Peter would never use a patch. Like, never, and use like a patch on us as they got more developed. You get synthesizers with pre-set patches. Nowadays, there's thousands of them. But the last thing in the world he would ever do is use anything that you would find on a keyboard that anybody else could use. That's one of the things that made his record sound so unusual. Like that sound, you can't find that sound. That sound that you blended together with the guitar, the piano, leaking in the background, and whatever other sounds. That's unique to that record. Mm-hmm. No one else has access to that sound.
Yeah, I'm sure if you listen to snare drums over time with Peter, they never sound like a snare drum, and they keep changing. He's always trying to make things not sound like classic motivator for pianos as well.
As well, yeah. And we always had it set up, the console was always set up where we had, it wasn't a very big console, it was 56 inputs, so we had maybe 8 dedicated channels for the effects returns of the 16 millimeter sound. And we would often have, so we had like a reverb, a couple of reverbs, so there was an RMX 16 MS, there was a Quantec Room Simulator, we had a plate, an EMT plate, we had the Revox tape snap, and we had an AMS delay, a Delta Lab delay, and then there was a couple of other like chorusing effects. And then the idea was, and this is how the way the down likes to work. You would say, okay, here's the sound, and we would cascade effects into one another. So literally, as you're playing, you start to hear this effects being generated and then generate back on themselves, and so it would create a whole illusion from the digital source files. And rather than leave that to chance to have to recreate it later point, every time you came back to the sound, we love the way that sounds. That's just going to work match that sound into tape machine, and that became the sound. So it wasn't, it was inspired by the guitar, but it became, it evolved into the sound.
And how does that collaborative process work for you? It seems like you're part of the ensemble too, and Peter must have been giving you some guidance for what to do with those recirculating delays with reverb. Or did you just sort of become simpatico with the band also, and you sort of knew the right directions to explore, just as Jerry knew the right from?
Yeah, from the very first day, he just encouraged, he encouraged your participation. Felt like you were a kindred spirit. He wanted you to branch out, and even if it meant making a mistake and doing something that wasn't. Peter loves the happy accent. He loves to walk into a room and suddenly hear something he's never heard before. That was Terry alluded to, would take him up at times. And we actually had one of those. There were many instances of that, but the one that sticks most strong in my mind is. So on the original version of Mercer Street, it was actually pitched higher. And after we've gone through the whole period of the summer where we finally figured out a way of retrieving all those lost performances from slavery as back onto the master, we had compiled a new master, a digital master, on the 32-track machine. And I was running, in conjunction with that, I was running a separate news thread for tracks. And one day I was doing something on the Mitsubishi where the berry speed was engaged, but it was engaged, so the machine was running at its slowest speed. It was like 10% below. And we were having a conversation, and then whatever I was doing, it rolled into the next song. The next song was Mercer Street at the time was called For Road. And because it was running at a lower pitch, everybody's head just turned and was like, what is that sound? Because suddenly those triangles have a higher pitch, suddenly more grainy, at a different timbre to it. And that then became like an inspiration for the whole layer folklore idea. And so it was just complete how that particular thing again. If you actually, I think on the 12-inch version of the selection, which was released on that, the original pitch of the song was released on
the in my experience with him, technologically, he really didn't. He wasn't that immersed in technology. In like, okay, run it through the delay, and then this, and then that. He just, like you said, he wanted you to do something. If you fit them, fit in, and he liked you, and he thought you were creative. It's like, do something. Just play around with it. But he wasn't really. I never found him deeply immersed in himself, knowing what all the technology does, and he was too busy, being creative and thinking in a different way, than learning about how EQ works and delays work and reverb. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It's good. It was a good thing. He didn't get too bogged down in the technology, but you get bogged down in the technology.
But somehow guided both of you. So Peter Gabriel was a drummer, but he instead would work with the greatest drummers on the earth to play the drums for him. He doesn't get into the reverb and the delay and how to mix and how to patch. He would let someone do that, but somehow he guides you, inspires you, or somehow puts you in this idea.
Absolutely, yeah. You always felt you were in a collaborative environment. You felt like present something that was appeal to him and he was going to. So that was a wonderful gift on any record. And that's what we all love to do. We love to see that how do you take the same instruments, the same palette of sounds that are all working, and create something that hasn't been working. And so here's, that's a real incredible gift.
Yeah, and on the again on the sorry, referring back to the security record. We recorded it in that barn, and before the studio was really good. But he had this idea. I can't remember exactly. I think what happened was we were experimenting with room sounds, distortion, and compression. And we were playing in the room and playing the drums, and then they get the drums to sound incredible, and then you hit a cymbal, it sounded awful because a cymbal, snare drum, and a bass drum, that's like recording a flute, a violin, like they're three drastically different sounds. Why would they don't necessarily always, depending on what you're doing to them. And in this case, heavy compression, as you know, and distortion was working really well on the drums, the low tones, but then the cymbals sounded terrible. So the famous no cymbals record was just really get the cymbals out of it. Just can't hit them because they don't sound good. They're overdub sounds, recorded like cymbals should be. And this is a great thing, and it's also that thing of kind of the happy accident, which is so oftentimes what happens. And with Peter, really creates those in that environment where it's not, no one's really sure what's going on. But in the end, when you put it all together, it was just working. And in the end, I don't think anybody felt like the record needed cymbal crashes. Because now when the song was going into the chorus, let's say, and there was a drum fill of some kind of fill, and then there's a guitar fill, or like that comes in on the chorus. You hear it like a cymbal crash. You don't hear a cymbal crash masking it. You know what I mean? And then out of the trail, the decay of the cymbal, you hear that sound. Those sounds hit right on the downbeat of the chorus, and it's incredibly effective. That had a big effect on me. He had a major effect on me by the way I worked on music. But it's that situation where necessity was like, okay, let's not hit the cymbals, and we'll do the cymbals later, which was incredibly frustrating.
But it's necessity the more
Peter and I were like, sometimes we were just like this, because I'd been so used to this crashing cymbals, before I ever, drum. Well, bam. I said, okay, do everything, just don't hit the cymbals. It was incredibly accommodating. I would come in and there'd be like pillows for the cymbals. Hit something. I understand you have to hit something, but you can't make any sound.
So you've both kind of talked about the happy accidents and then these constraints, and it seems that part of that was a result of the ethos of being residential musicians in the studio for a long time, and for those participants in the course who are not maybe used to that kind of thing. Do you have any strategies for how to create those same happy accidents or those same kinds of things that you just stumbled into in today's environment where people are maybe producing at home in the box or not necessarily having the luxury of a large studio?
It's much more difficult in the box because if you look at any DAW, it's like a word talking. Open it up, it's in exactly the same place as you're at. And I was physically taking a reel of tape off the tape machine, putting it on the next song, physically putting it on the tape machine, threading the tape on, and then locating the spot where the next song is going to be played. I may have forgotten to go to the patch pane where all my patches and things that I patched to the previous replay. And all of a sudden, maybe I might have cross-patched the bass into the guitar chain or something. Even just for a moment, if I just hit play, I might have something that I hadn't expected. That never happens in the DAW environment. It's exactly mirrored. So the randomness of the analog world in a way, gave you many opportunities to discover things that might have been closed. So that doesn't happen. So you have to force those now in the digital environment, especially in the home setting. And we also had an environment where people were collaborating, like multiple people were collaborating all the time. It was encouraged. And even though you might have a worse idea, it might ultimately lead to a turnaround. Whereas when you're working in a smaller environment, you're the musician, you're the engineer, you're the artist, it's very difficult to be brilliant at all those different tasks. We all found our balance within that. Certain times there were certain people who were more forceful than others depending on the situation. Some person rose to the occasion, but embraced. And it's much more difficult to do that in development. That's not because if you break everything, in that situation, and in other students.
Would it be fair to say that a little bit the way the day was divided for you guys was you were exploring and creating during the daytime and then fixing at night? Because I think there's the temptation in the box. These tools can fix so many things that someone might get weird into. I need to fix all this stuff, and you didn't. You had time to fix stuff that was going on with synchronization, but you had set aside other time for exploring, making music. Maybe that would be a discipline someone could tell themselves. Don't tune vocals or replace sounds when you feel creative.
We never. I mean, it was always created during the daytime, and during the daytime and the nighttime was just the technical stuff as you surmised. So it really was, and because we were recording to tape, really the idea was first you had to come up with a great idea, then you had to come up with a great song, and then you had to. And the arc in which all those three aligned might be a couple of minutes, might be half an hour, might be 2 hours. But we were surrounded by great gifted players, so generally speaking, when we got a tape that we loved, it was brilliant. It didn't need to be fixed because if there was a mistake, we rolled back and punched in what we thought. Or if we discovered during the process of recording, let's just say David Rhodes, for instance, he comes with a very unique guitar part. So let's say he would often try and figure out a new guitar part, and then by the time he gets to the end of the song, he goes, "Oh, I've got it now. I've actually figured out what I want to play," and then we'll go back and play over the top. So sometimes that it was never the thing of like, that's not good enough. Definitely we should keep it. It's like it's not good enough. It's kind of we've limited tracks, and we get very disciplined about getting rid of stuff.
I think another way also to kind of look at it is it's not about fixing. It's like during the day, everybody wanders off and finds things. Like gathers together a basket full of stuff. I've got this, that comes in with this, and then in the evening you kind of put it all together and you see what you can make it. You know what I mean? It's kind of, because in my experience with people, that's oftentimes what we were doing. We never walked in and recorded a song like in
the traditional sense.
Yeah, exactly. It was we started to gather, and he was gathering together and with us the ideas of how he wanted things to sound, and then there has to be a point where somebody like you,
Dan,
right, stays after school and sort of starts. It's like a Rubik's cube, You start playing around with it, seeing what works together, what doesn't work together. And I think to what you were saying about people now, the digital thing, it's what's happened is actually never before has it been more have people been more able to do in a way that we did that. Because back then, to do what we were doing was very expensive. I mean, to have people hired in for that kind of time, people just didn't make records for that. They didn't do that for the most part. But now, I would encourage people now, because you can have people have access to super technology, and I would say to people, really, there's no rush to do anything. Take your time, experiment, try different things. You're at home, you're doing it yourself. it's not costing you anything. You're not paying anything. You know what I mean? Like once you get whatever your source material together, people should think more about being more creative and trying to do things a little differently than what's sort of been accepted. And I think that with the demise of the music business as we knew it, there's less and less people standing over your shoulder going, no, you can't do that. This is a hit song. You can't record it. You have to do it this way. We've both been through that many times. Where the record company steps in and they're paying for it. And they want it to be a certain way. With Peter, ironically, that's the only record really that broke the mold for him. But, I remember being in the dining room at Ashton House, and there was a guy from Planet Records, a very famous guy, who came in and was listening to stuff, and then he tried to convince Peter that he should sound more like Mike McDonald. And I know that's funny, and I think we'll probably all agree. And Mike McDonald is a super guy's brilliant. But that was not a good move, because Peter was never going to do that. But, I lived through a lot of that, like over the years, record after record, people trying to get him to sound like something else or like somebody else. And very interesting. Now there's so much less of that. Now everybody can basically do whatever they want. They're doing it on their own. Nobody's paying for it. And I think that people should take advantage of that and experiment and try to do things different. I think the thing that would be interesting in a recording situation, this would be a Peter thing, is if you have sounds and EQ and you put effects on things and you get it where you think it sounds really great, and you press a button and it just takes everything and it moves it to somewhere else. Like your delay that's on your guitar is now on the kick drum. It just randomly tosses everything, and that's very much a kind of a Peter thing. But you try something, to do something that no one would, putting a delay on something or affecting something, because as an engineer, we sort of tend to fall into that certain things sound right on certain things, and it's hard to break free from that. But that's part of the thing that I think this technology now, as it gets more extensive, that people can do that kind of thing. Really try to affect the music and make it sound different.
So creativity really is a discipline. You guys bring that discipline even to today's production environment. Give yourself time to do random and exploring, and other times where you make yourself do that today.
Yeah, because nowadays, the constraints are usually budgetary. Everybody wants to make a classic sounding record, and with the budget, if you're going to go to a commercial facility, even a semi-commercial facility, you're really going to 2 weeks. I think one of the things that you very early on after you left Genesis, he recognized the need that it was part of his own methodology of recording that he wanted to his library, his own time. So he would take his record advances and the studio evolved over time. So Jerry was doing stuff, fire records, the studio wasn't good. Talking about it was more fun. And the full realization of what was real work.
It was more fun than also technology.
Yeah.
Digital technology really made it very, and Peter was way on top of it.
He was
on so much so that he with his cousin, he opened up a store in London. So they were getting like all the gear. They were getting everything. The store was getting every new piece of equipment, anything they had. So he was able to get his hands on newest technology, and that's what I think made that kind of semi-home studio really explode.
He was one of the first artists who had him in the studio. Maybe, like, I'm sure there were other artists who had him as well. I mean, he took it to a new level. Certainly, the constraint of time didn't impose itself on this particular. And whereas now in the current environment, it's really that is the big issue. People want to make album work. I really do believe artists want to make best-selling records they possibly can. Again, there's the pragmatic side. enough about his eyes. And it really needs to be 15 articulate. So, and so I draw my experience and go, okay, realistically, what can I do? What can I do to make these effective? I'm still interested in making the best thing, especially in this generation where music truly sounds rooted, and really the artist and the producer and the MC's vision can actually be heard on. Again, is rarely heard, which is the thing I find most fascinating. Since the advent of the wax label to vinyl to cassette to first iteration of CD to digital audio tape, audiences never really heard what I've heard in the studio or mastering. They've never heard that portion. They've heard an approximation of it. And now, when you actually can, we've gotten down to the worst sound recording ever in the history of the world. And that's what people are responding to, and I don't think that people really respond emotionally to it. How can you take something and downsample and say, well, we're going to just drop pieces of information and somehow this album is going to magically, what's it taking away? It's taking away something. It's taking away some of the emotion. It's taking away some of it. Just to me, we've gone about it. So when you look at how to be brand and how to kind of create environments where musicians can be creative, then yeah, the technology, we can put an amazing sound in the sound. As long as we can pay the overhead those expensive
Did you find, just very quickly, I always refer to it, that period of time of working with Peter, particularly the security record, is walking on the moon. I got to walk on the moon. And not a lot of people get to do that. Did you find that after all of that time working with Peter on that record, when you go out into the real world, unintended, but you go out and you go to a studio with an artist and a producer and it's like, you hear the piano, guitar, voice thing that you mix on one, but people don't want it. Or they don't want to spend the time to, it's a whole different environment. And, in a lot of ways, I had struggled with that because all of those years of working with Peter and what I learned from him about the creative process, when I would take that into a session here in New York when I was playing on somebody's record, they want to cut, 10 tracks in 3 or 4 days. They, it's frustrating because when you hear something, there's something there, but we got to find it, and it's going to take time. Peter's thing was, we're going to take as long as it takes to find that thing. And it's more frustrating because, to work in a different environment where that's not the agenda. People are like, just want to get the record done, need drums on it. Those drums just need to have them sound like drum. Like drum beat. So it's very interesting. It's kind of frustrating for me and it's one of the reasons why I really don't work on that many records. I don't put myself in that position. I haven't in a long time, but I just can't because it's not fun for me. It's not fulfilling. To just go in and be the drummer and play, especially when the music is good. If the music isn't very good, then it's easy. But if there's something really there and they're not getting it or they're missing it, and we come from that. We've walked on the moon. You know what I mean? It's very difficult. I find very difficult.
It's interesting from my perspective that when I finished the record with Peter, Peter pulled me aside and he said, you do realize, so there were a lot of issues on the record, like from a technical perspective, which I wrote back. I said, I'm going to tell you some brief, but so when we got close to the completion of the record, there's a part of me that I only was hearing the flaws in the record. I was hearing my process in the record, Dan's process in the record. I was hearing all the things I wish I would have done something different. Insecure. And I went down to London to master the records. And he had mastered all Peter's requirements. And he was saying, listen to the record because really amazing records. And it sounds amazing. And I was hearing it through a different set of ears. But I came back to that in Peter, getting ready to kind of all go to our next projects, and he told me something, and said, you realize you're going to need to hire a manager. You make 25. What's a manager going to do? So you're going to have so much work. Right? And it's not that he thought that the record was going to be like a huge runaway success, but he just thought that in a certain realm of music, that there would be work for him. And so I literally took a 2-week break, and then I came back to New York to work on a project here, and then literally the phone started ringing. Just as soon as the record came out, people started calling. And what they wanted was, they wanted that sound for their record. I had so many requests.
Well, that's the other thing.
Yeah, so they wanted that sound. I said, well, how did you get that sound? I was like, well, we had X number of days to get that sound.
Right.
And so, and there's a certain number of musicians and a certain style of all that's around the player. You've got that result, so you can't necessarily just swap like for like and stuff. Even if you have the same musicians, and sometimes we actually got hired, like maybe it was Manu and Tony and David Rose all got hired, and me hired on the same project, and they really wanted that sound, or they wanted a prior version of it. And yet the music was the thing that dictated how people play, dance, brilliant production, it was brilliant, it was good numbers. It was the assembled cast. You can't just sort of the whole portion of it expected.
Right. You want that sound. First of all, start by writing that song.
Right.
That's the first thing.
And then
people think,
sing
take
that
my
way.
song and turn it into Wallflower or Don't Give Up is a classic example. The bass line on that song is just staggering. You can't just. And Tony's very good at doing that kind of, even on something that's not as well written as Don't Give Up, but having people hire you to do that thing, which is so unusual.
Well, one of the things that was one of the questions I often get asked about, especially with Tony's part, he would say, "How did you get such an amazing bass line?" And I was Tony that. I mean, well, I didn't do anything.
Yeah.
And the thing, and Jerry will know this, is really working with Tony. Tony's that he's a force of nature. You will sit there and you come into a session and you hear a song, and he'll sit and he'll start playing around, and he's formulating an idea. And it's an interesting idea. You think, okay, this is really cool. But it doesn't sound amazing. Like, it's not necessarily perfect in time. It's not necessarily the greatest thing. But and you usually just take it direct. It's just a direct projection. And he'll do another pass and he says, "Oh, I think I have a part." You rewind the tape after that. This is all those DAW users out there. This is 2 minutes to have rewind the tape. You go off the top, and then you hit play, you win the record. And literally out of nowhere, this sound would appear in front of you. It was like big, thick, 3-dimensional. Did somebody just step on a pedal? What just happened here? And it was like, that man on that bass, those fingers, and that music kind of use that sound. My job was to go, I'm really good, I'm just going to stay.
Yeah,
make sure you're in the chord and stay out of the way. And so, people talk about, what did you do? Your job is to realize when something great is happening and to not do it. Be the documentarian, be the bystander, make sure you follow it down. That happens so many times with all musicians in the world. They were bringing so much music out, and because the environment was so conducive to create flow, just became that thing, just completely. That's great. There's lots of great parts that never made it to the final thing. As the lyrics evolved, some of those parts had to be discarded. They weren't discarded lightly. We think, oh, that's a fantastic record. Maybe I'll end up on another record. Ultimately, Peter doesn't discard it. One of the songs on the record, I think there were about 16 songs initially, and we got it down to about 12 and I arrived, just after I arrived. And then we got it down a few more. There's a song called Courage that we all felt was a really strong song. It was kind of in the big time, kind of sledgehammer. But he couldn't find a lyric, couldn't settle on a lyric that he loved. So the record came to completion and he never finished the lyric. He actually finished the lyric last year, and he released it as part of the 2 years ago. So he never gave up on the idea. says a lot about his creative spirit. Not that he knows it's a great thing. That actually portions out for him. It's pretty cool.
We need to wrap up the online portion of this. We'll talk to you guys a little bit more afterwards. So just as a wrapping up gesture, I wonder if there are any other comments you might have. In particular, we talked a lot about this wonderful collaborative process, but would you have any advice for the self-producing, self-recording, highly motivated, creative, passionate person who's alone in the box to try to make it?
Try and find some good collaborators to work with. I think the best music is always maybe with one or two exceptions where you actually collaborate. You need somebody to bounce ideas off. I think that is the most effective way to not only inspire you, but also to get the desired results and perhaps even go beyond that. From my own perspective, when I'm perhaps recording or mixing, I know what my remit is in terms of what the artist expects, and then I like to go beyond and see if I can go beyond their expectations. And I think that's when you get the most satisfaction when you've gone beyond their expectations. And I think if you're doing everything, you can't be a master of every discipline. If you're lucky in life, you can be a master of one. But for this expectation, just because you can't do it yourself, that you should, it's such a rabbit hole. So I highly encourage the collaboration with peers.
Which happens less and less now because people are working on stuff, and they're trying to save money, and they're doing stuff one piece at a time, and oftentimes, then they'll get to drums, and whoever's doing whatever they're doing, you're working to this thing that is a movable object. There's no room for when you get a group of people in a room together, and this has happened so many times. You're playing through the song, you get to the end, and you're kind of vamping at the end, and then there's 3 minutes of vamp, and it turns into the bridge. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, that's amazing. That kind of thing doesn't happen unless you're playing with people, or you're interacting and you're working off the run. That sort of thing happens less and less. So I agree with you that try to collaborate with people, experiment with different people, and doing your thing and seeing how it works with somebody else.
It's really fascinating to hear music. Like I'll get to experience it. I'm working on a mix all day long, and the artist shows up and we play that. So at least where I'm at that moment in time, and all of a sudden I'm hearing the mix through his or their and it alters my perspective. You don't get that, when you're only because the tendency, human nature is to always think I'm really good, and the technology allows you that, forces that opportunity, so you can remove everything, complex, each program. At the end of the day, maybe that's not the goal. Maybe it's the beauty of music is actually in flaws. So when you do it all by yourself, you have to recognize the flaws and the wrong flaws.
Well, thank you both so much for giving us the time and sharing your stories and your expertise with that. Give me a big hand. And again, if you've been watching the live stream, we will have a higher quality edited version up for you in a day or two. So thank you again for attending online, and we'll see you at livethroughmusic.org. Thanks.